Hi, I'm Will Johnson, also known as Power Nerd Insights. I work as a senior Power Platform specialist for Vantage 365, and I'd like to welcome you to this Power Nerd presentation. Topic is Power Platform controls. As I said, we're going to be looking at a few things. So we do have an agenda. So we'll be going through the introduction to start with. Obviously, this is that. We're going to be looking at what controls are, essentially just defining them in a single sentence. We're going to look at some of the most commonly encountered and used controls that you'll find within kind of Power Platform solutions. And we're going to look at some of the cooler controls that allow us to do kind of some fun little functionality and other little bits. So, rules of engagement. These are essentially the rules we set out for this session. When we look at this, I am a firm believer in there is no such thing as a stupid question if you don't know the answer. I would like you to attempt in this session to test that theory. I have a toddler. She asks lots and lots of questions and she is yet to ask a stupid one. So if you can outclass a toddler for that, well done you. While we're going through the session, if you have questions while obviously we've got it in the audience mode, please do drop them in the chat. I'll make an attempt to try to answer them then and there if it's relevant. But if it's not, or I might show it later, I'll potentially skip over it and then answer it when we get to the kind of the Q&A section at the end. In the meantime, sit back, have a read, take notes. If you want to make your own recording of this session, please do, because obviously it takes me a bit to process these recordings that we get to then get them out here. So, that being said, let's launch right into it with our first bit. What are controls? So, very simply, controls are something that is available out of the box from Microsoft. There is a large list of controls. These are things that can be applied to a model-driven app to change the user interface. You can add them to specific fields or data sets, and they change how the data that you're dealing with is displayed or interacted with. Very simply, that's all they do. They just change that kind of UI element and how you interact with it. You can obviously produce your own controls as well. This is using what's known as the Power Apps component framework. So you'll hear a term bandied about quite often called PCF controls. These are custom controls that are created using Procode, most of the time using things like TypeScript and a little bit of HTML and CSS that you can then apply to do pretty much the same thing, give UI elements or interactable elements and change how your data is interacted with. For instance, one of the most recent code components I've worked on when it comes to PCF controls was the ability to drag and drop files from File Explorer into a React box in a model-driven app and have it upload to a related SharePoint site. But what we're going to be looking at today is the out-of-the-box features that Microsoft give us when we kind of deploy Power Platform and what we can use with those. This is predicated with the fact that obviously when we're looking at these out-of-the-box controls are predominantly applied to model-driven apps, and obviously for access to model-driven apps you need access to Dataverse, which comes with the whole premium licensing aspect. But it's worthwhile knowing what these controls are because they can actually help in terms of making model-driven apps just feel a bit nicer, work a bit nicer, and obviously kind of appear how we want to appear. And if you were present for last week's session, we actually already looked at a control. We looked at the Power Apps Grid control, which is relatively new, and some of the limitations around that. So you'll already have some idea of what controls are. So that's what controls are. Let's get on to the fun stuff. So we're going to start with the most common controls that we might see when we come to model-driven apps and the controls package. So one of the very first things that we might see when we look at kind of solutions out in the wide open world is the flip switch control. So this is known as a field control. Now I'll explain the difference between field controls and dataset controls in a moment. But this field control is used on yes/no choice columns. Now yes/no choice columns are obviously a subtype of choice column. But this kind of flip switch control makes it really easy to flip between true and false values. So a demonstration of this, if I can pick the right spot, is over here. I have a table that's called demo data type. I'm customizing the form here, so we're getting a look into how we apply field controls here. So this is really good to note. I have, you can see here, a field called flip switch control. It is a yes no column right there. And I want to apply the flip switch. I don't want it to appear as a drop down where I have to select false or true. I just want the user to be able to basically just have a toggle. So to apply a field control, we select the field we want to apply the control to. We hit components, we hit new component, and most of the time, if you're dealing with a true false column, the toggle control will appear here. So we click that. We choose whether we want that component to show on web, mobile, and tablet. Obviously, you can choose whether it appears on a desktop, whether it appears on a mobile, but most of the time you want this to turn up on every view. We hit done, and then as you can see, that's now changed. So as you can see, all that kind of control has done is just changed how we interact with that field. That is a field control. We've applied it to a specific data field there, and we've changed the UI elements of the control. Right. If I save and publish this, as we see it here, I'm going to go into my demo controls app. So you can see here demo data types. If I select type A, what I should see if I refresh my screen, still publishing, that'll be why. So if we wait for that to publish, that says saved and published. Refresh my screen over here. Of course, live demos, always live demos. There we go. So with that on, now it's just true, false. Great, not a problem. Whereas if I had taken that off, removing them is relatively simple. We just come to the components bit and hit delete. If I had taken that off, obviously that control would have taken two clicks to be able to toggle it between the two, whereas now it takes one click. So again, it's that little bit of time saving, little bit of UI elements, and you'll actually see that quite often kind of out there on solutions. In terms of use cases for that component, essentially anywhere you've got a true, false, yes, no column, that's the place to use it. So, keeping with the field controls, our next one, option set. As we all know, when we're looking at kind of drop downs and choice sets, or where we've got choice columns, we tend to have a drop down control in there. There are different options for drop downs. The default in model driven apps is a drop down kind of view when you've got a choice column that is an option set. Well, actually, there is a control called option set, which is a field control. It's used on choice fields, and it makes it easy to select just an option without actually interacting with the drop down. So again, if we are applying this control, it's relatively easy to do. We come into our form, we choose the field that we want to apply it to, we hit components, we hit new component, and you'll see here it's option set. If you don't see it here, you'll need to hit get more components and then search it in here. So when I choose option set and I hit done, you'll see that it then changes it to a list of options. So again, if I save and publish that, obviously I've removed the flip switch control off of there. If I then come into my form, hit the refresh, and you can see that that's now back to being a drop down, and I can actually just select the option that I want here. Again, much easier, means that people can choose between kind of the options that are available to them in a quick and easy method. Rather than having to select the drop down, they can see them all available. Obviously, this is, in terms of use case, this is really only usable when you've got a small amount of options. If you had, say, 50 options in a drop down, you're probably going to want that to be searchable, so you're probably going to want like a combo box control or something of that nature to be able to choose that kind of choice set. But again, this is one that I've seen quite commonly in solutions that I've come into, where they've got 3 or 4 options and they want to just press the button. As you see, there's a bit of a common theme with these field controls, and the ones we've seen so far. They're designed to reduce the amount of clicks required for a user to get to what they need to. Now, obviously, the only issue with the option set control, so if I start up here and I try to tab through, you'll see that it doesn't tab into a specific option. So if I tab again, it just moves me on to the next field. So there is an accessibility concern with this kind of component there that you can't just tab to select the option that you want with the nature of that control. Obviously, that's a problem when it comes to one of the accessibility standards being that you can operate an application with just your keyboard because not everybody has access to a mouse. So it's something to be aware of with this control. While it is commonly used, it does have accessibility drawbacks. Okay, so on to the next control. So, next control, rich text input. So you might have actually already seen this control if you've built a model-driven app against a Dataverse table that already has multiple lines of rich text. But actually, you can apply this control into a multiple lines of text box no matter what it is. This is again another field control. It's used on multiple line text fields and it provides that full text editor capability like you would have in Word or other areas. And again, common theme here, when we come to apply field controls, we come into the edit mode of our form. We choose the control that we are going to be working on. We come down into components. We hit component. And you can see for multi-line text ones, there are loads of them. Some of these don't work. Some of them do. The one that we are going to be using is the rich text editor control there. So you'll see that it has this custom configuration URL. Essentially, you can enter custom JSON into this to change the default setup in terms of the rich text editor. That's things like the default font, whether the text is bold, whether there is a starting amount of text or default text in there. Obviously, we're not using that for the moment. We're just going to use this, but it is an option that's there and available. Once I select the component, you can see in there, we get rich text control and you get to choose the font, the size, whether it's bold, and all these other bits here. You can insert tables and other bits. It just means that actually your users can, when they're inputting their kind of multiple lines of text, you're not just getting strings of text. What this actually ends up outputting is HTML encoded text. If you were to drag this field into a Power Apps Canvas app label, you would actually just get the HTML version of it. But that is the rich text control. Large amount of use cases for this, I find. So we've had some use cases where users want to be able to paste an entire Word document in there. This enables that because it will maintain the formatting. We've had use cases where people want to write kind of a full-blown report against a specific record, and that's useful for that because it gives them that capability to kind of use the paragraphing, put things in bold, put headers in, do spacing, implement tables, all this kind of stuff in a really easy to use rich text control. But that is that control. Again, one very commonly seen and is actually, if I were to, let's say, pull in, there is a text column in here. I have. It has disappeared. Handy. But if I were to pull in a column that is already defined as multiple lines rich text, this would be how it would appear. Okay. So, coming back over, the editable grid control. Now this is our first dataset control. Dataset controls are slightly different to field controls. They're a bit more problematic to apply, but what they do is they don't actually apply to a form. They apply to a view. The way we access these dataset controls is through the classic editor. Now, has anybody had had experience with the classic editor before? Ooh. That's a really good question, actually, BOV, based upon our previous kind of control. The advantage of using rich text format rather than just a text box. So there is a distinction that Dataverse specifically makes between rich text versus plain text. The rich text basically saves it as HTML encoded text. It means that if you were to pull it into, let's say, Power Automate for usage in an email, and you wanted to send that the contents of that rich text box in an email, the email would maintain its HTML formatting. But if you were to put it into plain text, it would literally, even if a person had pasted it in with kind of paragraph lines and bold text, it would lose all of that formatting. Plain text is really useful for if it's just simple data. We're talking, the name of something or something that isn't detailed, kind of qualitative data is what I would define. Rich text format's really good for qualitative data. That answer your question? Cool. Good. The editable grid control. Now, we're going to go into, like I said, a bit of a dark spot in the Power Platform space. So you'll have to follow along with me where you can. So you can see here I've got a solution. It's our demo controls app. I've got demo activity and demo activity type. I want to apply the demo activity editable grid control to the demo activity view. Now, normally, what you would think in terms of implementing this control is come into the view and edit it. Come up here to components, hit the button, hit add a component, wait for it to load, and then choose editable grid, and then define what you want it to do. Bearing in mind the editable grid allows you to display child items inside of it. This is very similar to the Power Apps grid. It's kind of an earlier version of that. It's not entirely editable, but you can choose whether it's got child items in there, whether it's got group by, what layout you want to set up, so whether it's vertical or horizontal, and whether you want to enable filtering and a few other things. So if I hit done on that and I hit save, we would think that, yep, great, that's in there. I can hit save and publish, and it'll work. But the problem is, when we do this, your view could not be saved and published. Try again later. We end up with an error that basically says, hey, we're not able to do it here. So how do we actually apply it? Well, we have to go into the classic editor. So to do that, we come over here into the cog icon on the top right. We hit the little cog. We hit advanced settings, and then we get greeted with the landing page of the classic editor of kind of Power Platform, which was originally obviously based on Dynamics 365, hence why we've got this Dynamics 365 bit up here. You hit the little drop down, you go to customizations, you choose customize the system, and then you'll get greeted with this window here. It does sometimes take a little bit to load, so we have to wait for that. So now that we've got that open, we can see a big list of everything down here. Now, obviously, when we're in the modern editor, all of our kind of bits are labeled as tables. In here, they're not listed as tables, they're listed as entities. So we hit the little drop down on entities, and you can see here we get a list of every table that is present within our environment that we have selected. We scroll down, we find the table that we want to apply the data set kind of control to. So you can see here we've got demo data type. That's the one I want to do. You'll see it opens up. You got all this extra, but we've got this thing called controls here. Now you'll notice that when we were going through the field controls, I was telling you to go to the components part. Okay, that was relabeled for the modern view. From a perspective of working with Power Platform, we refer to anything that's kind of PCF based, including these out of the box things, as PCF controls or out of the box controls. Hence why the session is titled as controls in model driven apps rather than components. So you can see here that there's the default read-only grid. That is technically a control. The default view you see is a control, but we want to add a control. So we hit add a control, and you can see in here there's loads of controls. The ones that we want to work with, the one that we want to work with is the editable grid control. So we hit editable grid, and you can see there edit modes edit plus read, and it's a grid type. So we hit that, and then you get the configuration options down here. So if this table was linked to another table, I could click add lookup, and I could have this editable grid display the items that the item in the grid is parentified to beneath it. You can see here we've got subgrid parent ID. We can choose whether the group by is enabled, what layout is, what filtering, things like that. So now that's done, I need to obviously change over these to be the default view. Bearing in mind, you'll see here that for the editable grid, phone is not able to be selected. That's because the editable grid control is not supported on mobile viewing. Okay, so something to be aware of. So we then hit save. It should update the entity. We then hit publish. And then that should be that. We've applied the control there. We've configured it. We've done what we need to do. We come out. We come over into our app. We hit refresh. And then we choose our table. He says. It would appear that today it's having a bit of a fit. Let's give it another try. It's very true, VRV. Power App says no. It does happen occasionally. This is one of the joys of live demos, I guess. Okay, not a problem. What I'll do is I will work this out. I will work this out on another solution that I've got that I know it'll apply to. So you'll get to see that. Ah, no. So so BRV's raised a good point. There was an update that went out recently that did break a few things. Fortunately, that hasn't impacted Power Platform. It did, however, impact Windows Server. There we are, PAG-C. That's the one I'm after. So this is obviously the solution that I showed with the Power Apps Grid Control last week. You can see that my Power Apps Grid Control is applied there. I'm just going to go ahead and choose Editable Grid. Yep, that's very much the case, BRV. Power Apps is cloud hosted, as is Power Platform as a whole. I don't believe, though, they're running it on Windows Server. I might be wrong. Okay. Let's see if we can get an editable grid view up for everyone. PAG-C Asset Handler, that's the one. Hey, there we go. So this is what the editable grid looks like. Obviously you can see there, slightly different in terms of the view. I can turn around and choose group bys there, so you can see group by supplier name or supplier address. I have the option to do a few things in terms of I've got the ability to search by title down here. The contents, rather than just being an endless scrollable list, is actually paginated. So if I had more than X amount of records in here, it can be moved through. And again, it just changes that kind of visual view and interactability in terms of the solution itself. Obviously, when we were looking at the customization of that control, dataset controls are very much more customizable in terms of the properties that they have available to change than a lot of the field controls are. So when we look at, let's say, for instance, component type entity, let's go for custom. Let's see if we can't get the child items for that entity to display, because I'm pretty sure suppliers is linked to assets. So select it, and then, great, add lookup. So there's our subgrid. Entity should be, again, this is obviously all customizing it from inside that that joyous kind of classic editor. Asset supplier, there we go. Again, save and publish. So this editable grid is actually a lot more common than you would expect, purely because of one of the features I'm just about to show. Because it makes the viewing of data a lot easier. However, this control is probably less likely to appear from now on, given the Power Apps Grid control. But that's because the Power Apps Grid control has also the ability to do inline edits and a few other things. Okay, so now that I've done that, so you can see here, now that I can see the child items. So these are all assets that are listed under this supplier. So this is how useful the editable grid control can be. So from here I could say, okay, well, I know the asset I'm after is in this supplier, is being provided by supplier 2. It's the Dell XPS 13. Great. I can actually directly navigate to that record and then edit it from there. But that is the editable grid control. Okay, so calendar control. This one is massively common when we're looking at systems that are tracking events, or systems that are tracking meetings, or systems that are tracking activities that have a defined start date and a defined end date. And it does what it says on the tin. It essentially presents those kind of tables in the calendar view. It is another data set control, so you do have to apply it using that classic view. As you can see, it's used on tables with start, end, and durations, and it presents those activity tasks in a calendar view. So you will have noticed when I was in my solution, just over, he says, when I was in my solution here, we have a demo activity table right there. So this demo activity table is included just here. You can see that right now this displays as just a normal standard table, but it's got a meeting 1, meeting 2, meeting 3 with actual starts, actual ends, durations, delivery priorities, and a few other little bits in there that are hidden away. So what we're going to do is we're going to go in and apply the calendar control to it to look at what it can do, how we might use it, and how we change the presentation of that, because nobody wants to see a list of meetings as a list of meetings. People want to see it as a calendar because that's what we're used to, that's what we get served in Outlook. So if I click on customize the system, so same process, go to the little cog icon, go to advanced settings, customize the system, find the entity or table that you want to apply the control to, go ahead and find the table, so demo activity, hit controls, hit add a control, and then choose calendar. And you see there, it just says grid. So if we add that, you could then have to define what the start date, description, and end date columns are. These are mandatory. The control will not work without these. So when we look at this, start date is actual start, end date is actual end. This is description, so I'm going to make this, let's see, subject. That'll do nicely. And then I'm going to make the end date the actual end. And you'll see that obviously even in the classic view, this kind of drop down here only allows you to select columns that would actually work for this. And then duration here, I'm going to put actual duration. So save. And then publish. There we go. We come away with it. And then what we can do, now that that's published, we're going to come into our app, give it a refresh, and hopefully what we should see, he says, is up here in the top left. See the calendar button? Now this is a slightly different dataset control. It hasn't automatically applied like the editable grid did. That's because it doesn't. What we have to do is we have to choose calendar, and then it changes over to calendar. So now you can see it appears just like an Outlook calendar. We can choose month, and oh look, there's meeting 1, there's meeting 2, there's meeting 3. And if I actually click on it, I get the little pop-up. It tells me what things are, and if I hit more details, it takes me into the actual form view in it. So that's the calendar control. But again, a very common one when we're dealing with activities that have a defined start date, a defined end date, or specifically meeting tracking. And it is very, very useful for presenting things, again, in that nice manner. But it is always worthwhile noting that it's good for users to know that they have to press the button up in the top left. We have had a few support requests in my current role where someone's like, it's not presenting as a calendar, why isn't it? It's because they haven't chosen the calendar press. So that is the calendar control. Um, so our next bit is cool controls. So before we move on to cool controls, just essentially a brief pause. If anybody wants to write up a question or has any, I'll give it a minute. And if there are none, we'll continue into some of the cooler stuff. Let's move into some of the cooler controls. Now, these are some of my favorites at the moment, purely because while the other controls are good and they're quite commonly used, and they do change the display things, they don't do anything absolutely massive in terms of functionality or usability. They just change how certain things look. I think the two that give us obviously the biggest functionality there were the calendar control and the um, the editable grid. A lot of the field controls are pretty standard. They just change how you interact with things. But that being said, let's move on to one that is a field control that I absolutely love. Very, very often within kind of the consultancy and the kind of business space, we come along the argument of, well, we need to have a wet signature. We need to have a wet signature. We don't want people to just sign it with their account. They need to write on something. This is where the pen control comes in. It is a field control. It is specifically a lot of the time used for signatures, but it's essentially a drawing canvas. You could write anything on that, but it's really really useful for signatures in model-driven apps. I cannot stress that enough. If you want, for instance, one use case we had recently is they had an information management system where people were submitting reports and they wanted the compliance team to physically sign off the report once they'd completed the treatment against it. And they were like, but we're moving everything digital, so how do we get them to physically sign it off? Hey, the pen control. So, very simply, how do we apply this? Well, just like any other field control. So just over here, I've got a pen input. You can see if I bring it across, this is a rich text control. And it appears just like the rich text control over here. So this is a rich text column that I'm going to use as my pen input. When you're using the pen input, it has to go against a multiple lines of text column. So to apply the pen input component, we come over to the right, we hit the component button, and we choose pen input, and then we choose done. And then you see we get this absolutely huge thing that gets in the way of everything. But we have very little in terms of kind of how we do things. You can see here that we've got a button that says use all available vertical space, but even with that unticked, it's massive. While it is this big, it is kind of useful still, despite the fact it takes up so much room. But if I hit save and publish, and we wait for that to go through, now that that's published, I should be able to come into here, come into demo data types, choose a record, which is currently looks like it's now using our editable grid. It might have just gotten a few minutes into there. I'm just going to switch back to the read-only grid for now. But you can see here, I've got all my different controls, and I've got a pin input. Drop that in there, hit confirm, hit save and close. That's telling me I've exceeded my max characters for my rich text control. That's probably because that is just a multi-line text field. So always good to note. Try not to have max characters set. That's going to throw a fit now. See, this is the joys of trying to put something together in terms of demo and using holding hands up here. I used Copilot to develop the demo data types field, and it looks like it hasn't worked as I hoped. So bear with me one moment. So multiple lines text column is defined as single line of text. Okay. We may have a slight issue here, but it looks as if it's still saved my high. So let's actually have a look at that in terms of what it looks like in the actual table, because that's always useful to know. Yeah, so Vera, I can see the laugh of face on that. Yep, this is the joys of using Copilot, but Copilot is going to get a bit of an additional shout out in this one a little later because it is actually useful for some things. So if we go into demo data type here and I take a look at my pen input column, you'll see that it saves it in base 64. See there? So automatic conversion of image into base 64 because that's how Power Apps holds it. For those that have done work in terms of Canvas apps, putting images into Canvas apps, firing them through, into SharePoint as base 64 and converting it back, this would be relatively easy. But yeah, it converts it to base 64, makes it nice and easy, and it means that you don't have to worry about things like the image column being set up and then taking up your Dataverse file storage. So the pen input is really useful in terms of signatures because what used to happen before is people would use Canvas apps. They would then get the person to load their signature in as an image. It would potentially go into Dataverse as file storage, and then start consuming that file storage very rapidly when you're signing multiple things at a time. Whereas this just stores it as text, and it makes it really easy to keep an eye on. But yeah, that is the pen input. So on to the next one. Timeline. This is a dataset control. This is one that is actually, surprisingly enough, quite commonly used, but I put it in my cool controls because I absolutely loved the timeline control, especially when one of the most common things I end up working on are things like case management systems, ticketing systems, where an activity or a task has notes against it. So we actually use, where I work, a timeline control against our support cases, which allows us to record notes for the staff to see. It also automatically records any emails that come in with that ticket's reference and puts them against the model-driven app ticket. So again, really useful for when tracking activity on support kits. So if I come across to my app over here and I look at demo activities, the timeline control is actually already on the activity form. So if I choose, let's say, let's go for month, and I choose meeting 1 and go to more details, you'll see the timeline control here. So this is the timeline control. It's already on the activity forms by default because they expect notes to be added to a activity that's been outlined. Now, the timeline control automatically defaults to pull data from a table called notes, which is a default table that is provided by Microsoft when you spin up a environment. But when I hit a little plus, I can choose new notes. I can then get a nice little title box here. I can choose test note, uh, testing the addition of a note to view it in timeline. I can choose to attach files there. So I'm just going to go ahead and go to my pictures and I'm going to choose this one. And then I'm here, add note and close. And cross my fingers because this worked earlier today. There we go. So you can see there. That's what the timeline looks like. So you've got all your recent notes up at the top. You can actually filter that down, choose kind of what you want to filter by, whether it's a note, when it was modified. You have the option there to sort it by ascending or descending, or open up the information. But alongside that, if you've got an image or a file in there, you can click on it, and you should then be able to download it or open it. You've got the option to refresh. But alongside that, this doesn't just cover. So there we go. There's the image. You can then choose which ones you've bookmarked. So you can see over here, I can choose to pin something there. But alongside that, I can also then choose to edit a note if I've filled it in. But if there was other notes on here that weren't mine, I can choose to bookmark those notes and then be able to come back to them. And it's searchable as well. So it's really, really powerful for kind of your forms. In terms of applying it, it is slightly different to other dataset controls. If you want to apply a timeline control, and normally I've got a new tab set up over here, you come to the form that you want to edit, and you've got this little box over here that says components. And then what you do is you choose, it should be under, there we go, display timeline. And there you go. So you do have a load of advanced settings, so you can see what kind of quick entry record. I've only got a notes type. You can choose a display layout. I tend to leave it as roomy because cozy gets kind of problematic in terms of display. You can choose how many records are shown. This is the fun bit. You can set sensitivity to where load more records automatically. So if you have this set to low, when someone starts lazily scrolling, it won't load more records until they hit the very bottom. If you have it set to medium, when they get close to the bottom, it'll try to load a few more, but if they're scrolling too quickly, it won't keep up. If you set it to high, then it'll load a lot of records. The only thing you've got to be wary of is if you set it to high and it starts loading loads of records as someone starts scrolling, you'll end up having a slow response on the form. But you've got a load of other options in there as well, and you can kind of choose what gets done with it in terms of, do you want to link it to a table? You can select different commands and things like that. But yeah, that's the timeline control. Right. I did say Copilot would get another shout out. So the Copilot control. Now, right as it stands at the moment, we've seen all these controls working in model-driven apps. This is actually a control that isn't designed for model-driven apps. It's designed to be used in Canvas apps. I term it as a free-roaming control because it's not a dataset control and it's not a field control, so I'm not quite sure what it is. But the Copilot control is really cool, purely because of the fact that I'm in my Canvas app here. You can see I am in the tree view where screens is. I've got a components tab here. I can import components and then code over here. Now you see here I've got Copilot as an option. If I click that, just as a heads up, if you try to import Power Apps Grid Control, Response View Grid, Neither of those work. They just error when you try to put them on the page. The Copilot control so far is the only out-of-the-box control I have found that is able to be imported into a Canvas app. So once I've imported it, it doesn't look like it appears over here. Well, that's because they appear in a slightly different place. You can see over here, code components. I can choose Copilot. Now this one does take a minute because it is a custom kind of code control. I decide, okay, what data source do I want to give it? Well, these are actually things that you can get it to query about. So this is essentially giving the user of your Canvas app their own little copilot that's focused on specific tables. So for instance, if I go for, let's say, let's go for PagC suppliers. So there we go. Now, that's my Copilot control there. I haven't had to configure that. I haven't had to do anything with it. I can just have it tagged over the right-hand side. And then, hey, I want to ask a question about the data in my app. Well, how many suppliers do I currently have? If I can type, that would be helpful. It'll go away. It'll check that. And bearing in mind that this is focused specifically on the data that is in your Canvas app. So there you go. Currently have 5 suppliers. Some of them include supplier A, supplier B, supplier C, that kind of thing. So this is a really cool custom control that actually you can use in Canvas apps. Most of the time when we see custom controls in Canvas apps, they're built using the Power Apps component framework and they have to be imported in, obviously TypeScript and all. But this is one that's out of the box that we can now use. But that is the Copilot control. So that brings us to the end. I hope it gives everybody here kind of a good overview of some of the out-of-box controls that are available. There are more. There are things like a slider control that allows you to choose a range on a numbers thing. There's a star rating control which allows you to select up to 5 stars, which is kind of useful, but that would really, from a use case perspective, the only time we see the star rating system is on user feedback, and a lot of the time you're not conducting internal user feedback, it's external clients or external users that you want to interact with. So I haven't shown those today, but hopefully this gives you a flavor and idea of how controls work and how they change things in model driven app, what controls are available to you, what ones you'll commonly see, and some of the cooler ones personally I find. Thank you for listening. I hope you found it useful and got to learn something new, and I'll see you in the next one.